Hello, everybody. So this is a quick video in order to give you an overview of what the official communication from the Kremlin in Russia are and from the White House in the United States about the phone call that took place between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in the second phone call in which they discussed the ceasefire proposal of the United States. And what we have here now is quite significant. I mean, on the one hand, we have the Russians who immediately came out with a readout of the phone conversation. And we also have the Americans who again gave us a readout from how they portray what happened in this phone call. And comparing these two, reading them in detail and comparing them can help us to understand where the process at the moment stands. Because one thing is sure, which is that in the mainstream media, we only get a narrative spin and not proper analysis, right? So, let me just remind you where we stand. We had this agreement on March 11th that was struck in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, between the United States and Ukraine. And basically, what this agreement did is that it made sure that the Ukrainians are now on the short leash and that they agree that the United States negotiates on their behalf with Russia. The first part of the agreement, I did a segment on this on March 12th. If you want to go and look it up on the channel, you will find my detailed assessment about this there. But the important thing here really is that the United States outlines what should be achieved, and that it is now the time to begin a process towards lasting peace. This is the first significant part, right? That the Ukrainians had to agree to this one and actually signed off on it. And then that the United States establishes that it is that it is the US, which will communicate to Russia that Russian reciprocity is the key to achieving peace. So the Ukrainians agree that, okay, everything we decide here, you, United States, you're going to do for us on our behalf, because we now agree that you should lead the negotiations, right? This was one of the key and central points of this 8-hour negotiation marathon in Jeddah to twist the arms of the Ukrainians to the point where they would agree, okay, it's the US that does these negotiations. Then there's a couple of details that are mentioned, like that an exchange of prisoners of war would be one of the goals among many. Of course, the main part was that a 30-day ceasefire would start, right? This is what the US said Ukraine has to agree. This is something that Ukraine wanted, and actually, as I discussed before, this is something that, if it came true, would help the Ukrainians most, right? This would be in favor of the Ukrainians because they're losing on the battlefield, and it is utterly clear that they're losing on the battlefield. So a ceasefire would basically mean a freeze on the battlefield, which would be good for the Ukrainians, but which is the main reason why people in these channels and so on said the Russians will never agree to this. Also because the Russians said they will not agree to a ceasefire, right? So the question then was what will come out from the Kremlin about this. Let me also just point out again that in the Jeddah agreement between Ukraine and the United States, it was also it was fixed there that the United States committed to discussing these specific proposals with a representative of Russia. Again, it's the US in charge. And the Ukrainian delegation reiterated that European partners shall be involved in the peace process. Although this sounds as if though the Europeans would be involved, what this means is that the Europeans are excluded. It is clear the Europeans and Ukraine are not going to be on the negotiating table, period. That's what the US established here. Now come the backdoor negotiations that happened between US negotiators like Witkoff in Moscow in order to lead to the great phone call between the United States and Russia. And here we really need to go through what Russia tells us, because what Russia understands what this call was about is what will determine on whether or not the things can really move forward. And luckily, I can report to you that this looks very promising, actually, although, as Alexander Mercouris on his channel already established, the Russians are not giving anything away militarily, although they are making goodwill gestures in order to keep the process alive. And I would like to put most stress on this one. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump do not understand what is going on currently as a kind of a one-off grand deal, grand bargain, and it needs to be done with a handshake and then everything will be implemented. That's not what's going on. What's going on is a process, a peace process, and a process takes time. And this is what both leaders in the Kremlin and in the White House are most interested in. So now let's read the Kremlin's interpretation of or depiction of the call first. The leaders continued their detailed and frank exchange of views on the situation surrounding Ukraine. Vladimir Putin extended gratitude to Donald Trump for his striving to achieve the noble goal of ending the hostilities and loss of life. Confirming his fundamental commitment to finding peace, a peaceful resolution to the conflict, the president of Russia expressed the willingness to thoroughly work out possible solutions in cooperation with the American partners aimed at reaching a settlement that would be comprehensive, reliable, and lasting, and naturally take into account the essential needs to eliminate the root causes of the crisis as well as Russia's legitimate security interests. So what the Russians are telling us here is that on the grand scheme of things, of where the parties want to go, the Russians interpret that the Americans are on their side, that they want the same final goal. But that, of course, there is now details to work out, but on the grand scheme, we're on the same page, is what the Russians are telling us here. Now, an important part concerning US President's proposal to declare a 30-day ceasefire, the Russian side outlined a number of significant points regarding ensuring effective control over a possible ceasefire along the entire front line, as well as the need to stop the forced mobilization in Ukraine and rearming the armed forces of Ukraine. This here is, of course, very significant because it is a key component of what Russia wants to happen militarily and as a form of an agreement with the US and by extension with NATO in order to move toward a comprehensive ceasefire. So again, the ceasefire is not something that you establish overnight. A ceasefire is something that you work toward. And now we get into the most important technical issues, practical issues that the Russians want to see happen. It was noted that some serious risk exists pertaining to the intractability of the Kiev regime, which had repeatedly sabotaged and violated negotiated agreements. An emphasis was made on barbaric acts of terrorism committed by Ukrainian militants against civilians residing in the Kursk region. So here we have the Russians telling us that they told the Americans that they don't trust the Kiev regime, that they don't trust Mr. Zelensky, and that there should be put a lot of care on the handling of Ukraine by the United States, right? So that's apparently what they try to convey to the Americans, who they are now looking at as partners in the peace process. It was pointed out that complete cessation of providing Kiev with foreign military aid and intelligence must become the key condition for preventing an escalation of the conflict and making progress towards its resolution through political and diplomatic means. So here we have it. This is the Russians telling us what they want in exchange for a proper, for implementing a proper ceasefire. Cessation of military aid and intelligence, which is, of course, exactly what Donald Trump decided in the Jeddah, or what the US decided in the Jeddah agreement with Ukraine to restart. Right here, it was declared that an immediate lift would be would happen on the pause of intelligence sharing and military assistance to Ukraine. So the US basically restarting military aid. And now we know why, because military aid and intelligence is one of the bargaining chips that the US is bringing to the table with Russia. And the fact that they halted it before now means that they showed to the Russians that they are able and willing, under certain circumstances, to hold that support. And this is now one of the US bargaining chips, and the Russia recognizes that it is such and says, like, look, we need to work toward you stopping military aid while we work toward then getting to the ceasefire where we want. So we now see the outlines of how this negotiation will be narrowed down, right? Which it will happen through a limitation of support on the one hand in exchange for an ever-growing basket of ceasefires. And I'll come back to this in just a moment, but let's continue reading. Referring to Donald Trump's recent appeal to spare the lives of the Ukrainian servicemen surrounded in the Kursk region, Vladimir Putin confirmed that the Russian side was willing to embrace humanitarian motives and guaranteed that the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine would live and be treated fairly in accordance with Russian legislation and international law in the event of surrender. So again, Vladimir Putin again saying, "Okay, we're giving you something. We will try to spare the lives of the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk that are, of whom I understand are not that many out there anymore. But the ones that will surrender will benefit from the Geneva Convention and will be treated as prisoners of war, which means they will not be prosecuted or put into a prison indefinitely. That they basically can leave again once the conflict is over. I mean, all of these things are there, and so Vladimir Putin basically gives another thing that Trump wanted, so that Donald Trump can say, "Look, we achieved quite a lot. We got a lot in this process." And a next very important passage then here. During the conversation, Donald Trump put forward proposals for the parties to mutually refrain from strikes on energy infrastructure for 30 days. Vladimir Putin responded favorably to the proposal and immediately gave the relevant order to the Russian troops. This is one more, a big victory for Donald Trump, something that he can bring home and say, like, look, we achieved now a 30 days ceasefire on airstrikes, right, on energy infrastructure on both sides, which is a first way to then also check whether the Ukrainians are going to be able to live up to their promise of stopping this. Alexander Mercury's pointed out that the Russians only sporadically fire at the energy infrastructure of Ukraine about once a month, and that the last strike just took place a couple of days ago, so that Vladimir Putin actually isn't really giving something away here. And I am not sure if I agree with him there. I mean, this is a first goodwill sign of the Russians that they're actually willing to limit their military approach, something which they previously said they wouldn't do. They said military fighting will continue while we negotiate a ceasefire. Now here, Vladimir Putin is willing to say, like, fine, we will stop one aspect of the military campaign, and most understandably, it's also one of the indirect ways of fighting this war, right? It's not a ceasefire where they stop shooting at Ukrainian soldiers. It's a ceasefire where they stop taking out infrastructure, especially, and this is important, it is infrastructure that is also used for civilian purposes. Attacks on this infrastructure was always a very delicate situation for the Russians because this is civilian infrastructure. Of course, the civilian infrastructure is used also for military purposes, among others, to manufacture some of the goods, some of the implements of war that are being used on the front lines. Especially, we know that Ukraine is manufacturing, of course, drones, right? The drone war, and that much of the energy infrastructure is also connected to sites where drones are being produced, which recently struck Moscow, right? So this here now is a first agreement on trying to start limiting the military actions taken, which is again a very positive step. Let's continue. Just as favorable was the Russian president's response to Donald Trump's suggestion to implement a well-known proposal regarding the safety of navigation in the Black Sea. The leaders agreed to begin talks to further work out specific details of such agreement. So this is a second place now where we are getting closer to normalcy, so that in the Black Sea you won't use military means, although the Black Sea is of course a place where very little military interaction actually took place. So again, this is from the Russian side, this is a low stake. This is a low stake area in order to implement military restraint. And the fact that the Russians worded this to say, like, it was Donald Trump who came up with the idea, it was the American idea, of course means that they want to signal that they are giving to the Americans, and that Donald Trump again can say, like, look, all of the little victories of the little check boxes that we are bringing to the Ukrainians, right? That the peace, return to peacefulness that we are delivering. So this is a very carefully worded approach, right, in order to make sure that the Russians are perceived as giving in to U.S. demands, although the demands here are not that difficult to agree to for Russia, these two. Next. Vladimir Putin made it known that on March 19th, the Russian and Ukrainian sides would carry out an exchange of prisoners, each swapping some people, and then 23 heavily wounded Ukrainians would also be included. So this is again something that harks back to the agreement between the US and Ukraine, right? A prisoner exchange. So Russia trying to live up to the demands of the US and trying again to show goodwill, actually, to show that we are serious. So let's exchange prisoners of war, which we are both interested in, and let's work from these grounds of common interest. Next passage. The leaders confirmed their intention to continue efforts aimed at reaching a settlement in Ukraine bilaterally, with due regard in particular to the aforementioned proposals by the US president. For this purpose, a Russian and American expert task forces are now being formed. There's a grammatical problem here. And American expert task forces. This should be, in my view, it's got to be the important thing here is that it's task forces. It's a plural. It's not just one task force. So it's not an American expert task force. It's Russian and American expert task forces. A Russian and American expert task forces. Yeah, this is a problem of the translation. But there will be several task forces, several groups of people, diplomat groups, Russians and Americans, who will negotiate different parts of this ceasefire that's now being worked on. And this is a very smart way of going about things. I'm quite convinced that the people in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs who are working on this, and actually in the State Department, both have a very deep knowledge and understanding of how the greatest breakthrough in the Cold War was reached, which was the process of the Conference on the Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, which later led to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and the breakthrough in these negotiations that took place over several years in Helsinki and in Geneva was that all parties that agreed, I mean, that were taking place, and was the whole of Europe, I mean, including Russia and all the way to Mongolia, right? Russia, I mean, the Soviet Union, of course, and East European states and West European states, they all took part in this. And the big breakthrough was when they realized that what you do is you compartmentalize the agenda. You create what is now termed baskets. You create baskets of negotiation and you put different topics into different baskets and you negotiate them separately. The human rights issue, you negotiate it separately from the arms control issue, right? So in that way, even if you don't have an agreement on the human rights issue, you still get the arms control issue and you can agree to disagree on one basket, but then you carry forward with the other baskets. And to me, reading that they're talking about expert task forces, this invokes that this is probably going to be the diplomatic strategy to compartmentalize the different aspects of the process that have to be hammered out and then continue at different speeds. But in order to push forward, you create those different issues and you keep them separate from each other. So I think this is what's going on from now on. The baskets of negotiations between the Russians and the Americans on different issues concerning the war in Ukraine. Let's continue. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump also addressed some other international issues, including the situation in the Middle East and the Red Sea region. Joint efforts will be made to stabilize the situation in the crisis spots and establish cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation and global security. This will in turn contribute to improving the overall ambience of relations between Russia and the United States. One positive example is the recent vote in the UN on a resolution on the Ukraine conflict in which the two countries aligned their stances. Here the Russians are telling us that, okay, the Middle East is actually part of this discussion and of this process because the process is bigger than Ukraine. The process is really one of rapprochement, of normalization of relations between Russia and the United States. And within that normalization process and rapprochement process, Ukraine is one of the issues, but there's other issues, and obviously this is probably a U.S. a US talking point or something that the US brought in. The Middle East is important to them. And of course, the question of Iran. And it must be pointed out, Russia holds some key leverage now with its security agreement with Iran on putting pressure on Iran to agree to some form of arms control agreement also with the United States. And actually, yes, Russia has every interest in making sure that Iran is secure and will not become a next victim of Israel or get bombed. But on the other hand, Russia also has a strategic interest in making sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear bomb. This is another one of these strategic alignments between great powers historically. And I tell you with absolute certainty, also if you look at the process of the negotiation for the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, that was negotiated, back in the days between 58 and 68, right? 10 years it took, but in the end, it was also an agreement among the P5, the nuclear five powers, that they want to make sure that other powers don't get the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb, right? So we have a long history of nuclear powers trying to keep others from achieving a nuclear deterrent. And so Russia, in this regard, has a strong incentive to negotiate with the Americans and make sure that the Americans understand that Russia will help Iran to defend itself, but will also try to work with the Americans to make sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear bomb, which is one of the main issues of the Americans. So actually, Donald Trump understands that also the way to a peaceful settlement with Iran actually also goes through Russia, and that they're connecting this. But they, again, I believe they will not connect it with Ukraine. They will actually take this apart. These will be separate baskets, because it wouldn't make sense to make everything part of the same agreement. But this will now be all negotiated. So this is the blueprint of the future negotiations. The leaders expressed mutual interest in normalizing the bilateral ties in light of the special responsibility for ensuring global security and stability borne by both Russia and the United States. Within that context, they addressed a wide range of areas where the two countries could establish cooperation, discussing several ideas aiming at fostering potential ties of mutual interest in economy and energy. I mean, this is the core. This is it. This is Russia saying that the Americans accept them as another great power, that they share responsibility in the multipolar world to foster peace and stability, and that in order to achieve that end, they want to normalize their relations, they want to have a rapprochement, and they want to agree on diplomatic means in order to do not world policing, but world stabilizing, actually. So this is actually very, very hopeful language. A last very interesting point then follows, which is that Donald Trump expressed support for Vladimir Putin's idea to hold ice hockey matches in both the United States and Russia between Russian and American players from the NHL and KHL. This is quite fascinating, because in international relations we have a subfield for diplomacy studies, and in diplomacy studies there's a subfield for sports diplomacy. Sports diplomacy has a long history: ping pong diplomacy, basketball diplomacy. Now we have ice hockey diplomacy. When states use sports events and sporting events in order to signal to each other that they're willing to again create people-to-people ties. And this seems to be one of these moments. And the fact that the Russians say this was Vladimir Putin's idea and not Donald Trump's idea means that they want to highlight that this is uncontroversial to the Americans, that yes, sure, we can do this, why not? Which is nice. Again, people-to-people ties and using sports as a vehicle in order to normalize relations is a good idea, because you really need to restart at this point social interactions between these two societies, right? So overall, I find this quite helpful. Let's look also at the Americans. The American readout that the White House produced is shorter. It's more concise, but it also gives us a couple of clues. Let's read it together. Today, President Trump and President Putin spoke about the need for peace and the ceasefire in the Ukraine war. Both leaders agreed this conflict needs to end with lasting peace. They also stressed the need for improved bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. The blood and treasure that both Ukraine and Russia have been spending in this war would be better spent on the needs of their people. So agreement that they want to end it. Both, they still want to end it. And this is significant, of course, because the media for the last week made us believe that if Vladimir Putin doesn't agree immediately to an unconditional ceasefire, then the peace process is over. Then he will have shown who is the problem. And no, now in the readout of both Putin and Trump, both readouts say that they agreed that this is a process and we will continue the process and we want to get to an end that is in sight, but that still needs thorough diplomatic work. And this is actually how grown-ups do diplomacy. You know, this is not this fantasy world of everything is hammered out over one single meeting. Again, the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe took 2 years. The Non-Proliferation Treaty took 10 years to negotiate. You know, these large agreements, international agreements, they are difficult. They take time. And de-escalating a war and negotiating a war to an end is something that takes time. And actually, both the US and Russia now agree this is the trajectory. This is the process, and we will work toward that process. So despite the fact that Vladimir Putin didn't accept an unconditional immediate ceasefire, the process now continues. The conflict should never have started and should have been ended long ago with a sincere and good faith peace efforts. The leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire and permanent peace. I also they have a problem with understanding this one. So the White House is saying, yes, we agreed that we will begin with energy and infrastructure ceasefire, and then negotiations, then technical negotiations, toward implementation of the maritime ceasefire, and then a full ceasefire, right? So again, the process is now defined. We start by stopping shooting at each other's infrastructure first. We hope this works. We check. This is also easy to check, easy to verify, right? And then we use the time and keep negotiating on further implementation. And we basically widen the areas of ceasefire, widen the areas of peace bit by bit. These negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East. Interesting enough. So apparently they're going to go back to probably Saudi Arabia, right? In order to keep negotiating there. That's what I take from this. The leaders spoke broadly about the Middle East as a region of potential cooperation to prevent future conflicts. They further discussed the need to stop proliferation of strategic weapons and will engage with others to ensure the broadest possible application. I found this interesting because here the Americans actually talk not immediately about nuclear weapons. Actually, they don't mention nuclear weapons. They mention strategic weapons, which is, of course, a broader category than just nuclear weapons. So apparently the Americans and the Russians are not in complete agreement on what they want to prevent from what kind of proliferation they want to prevent in West Asia. So it seems that the Americans have a goal of also preventing other weapon flows to Iran, and not just nuclear weapons. But obviously, they chose to use different language. But again, this is what's going to be part of the negotiation. But this tells me that the Americans want more from Russia than just their help in preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. The two leaders shared the view that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. This is also a no-brainer. Russia never actually agreed that Israel should be destroyed or that Iran should be able to destroy Israel. That is not the point. The point is that the Russians don't want Israel to attack Iran and Iran be destabilized from the outside or from within. I mean, they have an interest in a stable Iran and hence have created a security cooperation agreement with them. But the goal of there was never a talk about the goal of destroying Israel. at least not from the Russian side. So, last paragraph, the two leaders agreed that the future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has huge upsides. This includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. Again, here you have it. The whole goal of the Americans at this point, the one that they are giving us, is to create an overall stable environment and to normalize relations between them, and then help use this relationship in order to manage these two conflict theaters. One is Europe, and the other one is the Middle East. Now, there is this very important argument by Brian Berletic that I already talked about before. You will find that video as well on my channel, in which I discuss his argument that actually the United States is currently just changing its tactics when it comes to Russia because it ran into a brick wall, but that overall the goal of hegemony and world dominance hasn't changed. And that argument is to be taken very serious. What we are reading here in the way that these documents are phrased, it gives the impression that the United States, under the Trump administration, has seriously departed from the strategy of the neocons, and that that we don't necessarily need to expect a return, but there might be a return, right? There might be a new administration. This might be still part of a strategy to lure Russia into self-restraint, while then using time in order to arm both Ukraine and Israel in order to then have another push in the future. We are seeing right now in the Middle East how Donald Trump decided to bomb Yemen, and how Israel now restarted its genocidal campaign, killing spree against the Palestinians in Gaza, and very much will depend on the next couple of days on whether or not Donald Trump is going to walk this back, on whether this was either a mistake or some form of weird idea of bringing more bargaining chips to the table in order to force the Russians to also consider the Middle East. Maybe the Russians wanted to exclude the Middle East from the discussions because they have an interest of solving Europe first. Maybe this was a way of Donald Trump to actually forcefully and violently insert the Middle East into this peace process with the Russians. I don't know. And the outcome of this process is anything but clear. It is not clear that this will be successful. A lot will also depend in peace process on the role of spoilers. The Ukrainian government, even Ukrainian ultra right-wing nationalists might be spoilers if they overthrow whatever the government then agrees with, the Kiev government agrees with the Americans. The Europeans might act as spoilers, right? If they try to bring in some sort of weird form of peacekeepers against the will of both the Russians and the Americans. I would be surprised if they were able to do so, but still there are bad surprises can happen in these processes. But what we now know for sure, and this is the latest proof, is that both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump think of what is happening as a process, and they want the process to continue, and they will do whatever they can in order to make it easier for the process to continue, including the basketization or the compartmentalization of the discussions, creating different task forces, and taking into considerations the strategic goals of the other one, while trying to push as hard as they can for their own. And as we see, the Russians are not gullible enough to be convinced to immediately stop all military action, while on the other hand, the Americans have an understanding that the Russians won't cease all military action, and they are satisfied with a partial success, right? A first kernel of a ceasefire, and that kernel can now be expanded bit by bit. I strongly believe that this is the tactic or the strategy on both sides, and that now for the first time we have a situation in which the grand strategic interests of both Moscow and Washington actually coincide. And just out of pure self-interest, I do believe that we now have a chance for the first time in more than 3 years, for the first time in 4 years, in 5 years, a chance at a agreement between the great powers that might lead to a de-escalation. Let's hope the Europeans don't screw it up. But for now, looks hopeful. Thank you.